Well, if you've not been paying attention to the news for the last 20 or so hours, closer to 24 now, Vladimir Putin's Russia has started an invasion of Ukraine. And this is, I mean, listen, at a certain point, when you see 190,000 troops massing at the border and you understand that it really is starting to not make sense merely as a posturing exercise, what Putin is doing, you start to consider this might be the precursor to some kind of an invasion. And almost exactly as predicted by many, Vladimir Putin creating a pretext for that invasion, using all sorts of fluffy language like peacekeeping to justify that invasion, doing it slowly, but a slow invasion is still an invasion, and that's what we have going on. Stock markets around the world, very rattled in anticipation of what may be very erratic energy prices, further supply chain delays, and all of the economic sequelae we will talk about once we get a sense of what the scope of this is going to be. But for the time being, sort of following the Georgia playbook. That's not Atlanta, Georgia, where Marjorie Taylor Greene is from. I'm talking about the country of Georgia. And possibly all of this meant to goad Ukraine into an overreaction to provide an even bigger pretext for a larger scale conflict. So let's kind of talk through what is going on. Yesterday, so let me back up even. There are what we might call separatists in Ukraine. Separatists meaning they don't want to be part of Ukraine. They want to be part of Russia. Okay. Two of the regions in which there are such separatists are regions, and I'm going to do my best with the pronunciation here, the Donetsk region and the Luhansk region. These are on eastern Ukraine. You can pull it up on Google Maps and sort of take a look at where these are. So what Vladimir Putin did early yesterday, or actually it was early in the US, it was already kind of in the afternoon in Russia and Ukraine, is recognize those as regions, as legitimately recognize those areas as independent. So Putin is saying, okay, it's part of Ukraine. Donetsk is part of Ukraine. Luhansk is part of Ukraine. But there are separatists there who, quote, really are Russian. They speak the language. They want to be part of Russia. So we're going to say those are independent regions, not Ukrainian regions. Now, if you're Ukraine, you say, wait, hold on. It's part of the country. It's Ukraine. But Putin says, no, those are independent regions. He then, hours later, after some mild sanctions were imposed by the EU and the United States on Putin for doing this, hours later, and really the sanctions were imposed on those regions rather than on what we might consider Russia proper, Putin says, hey, are the separatists in those, quote, independent areas that I've recognized, they are under attack. So we need to go in and send in peacekeeping forces into that area. It's the Putin playbook, hook, line, and sinker. And there shouldn't really be anything surprising about it. This is what he was signaling for a long time. This is what various foreign policy analysts and experts were saying could be done for a long time. Some kind of pretext to then send in troops, but, they call them peacekeeping. But it doesn't matter how slow it is. It doesn't matter if you say you're there to keep the peace. It is still fundamentally an invasion. We have video where you see tanks rolling down the road. This was yesterday, shortly after this announcement was made. And of course, the question now is, to what degree is this going to escalate or grow? Now, there are some people who we'll talk about in a little bit who are really going out of their way to sort of defend and normalize what Russia is doing. And you can be against American involvement and be against war and be against violence the way that I am, and still recognize that this is a classic Russian playbook, that this is an invasion, that Russia has no right to send tanks where they are sending tanks into the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. And just imagine a similar situation with Mexico or Quebec. These are not perfect analogies, but imagine that Mexico said, hey, you know what? There are people in Texas and Arizona. They look like us and they speak Spanish, our language, and they would prefer to be part of Mexico rather than the United States in Texas or Arizona. So we are recognizing these enclaves of Mexican Americans as Mexico. They are independent as far as Mexico is concerned. Well, in the U.S., we would say, yeah, but that's the United States. And I mean, they could go to Mexico. You're not stopping. If you want to welcome them, they could go. And then Mexico says, well, listen, on the basis of the independence of these separatists, we're going to send some peacekeeping troops in. Come on, guys. Nobody would go for it. Think of Quebec. Another analogy. These are not perfect analogies, but they are useful in thinking about this. In Quebec, there is a separatist movement. Imagine that separatist movement in Quebec, Canada, said, well, we don't want to be our own country. We want to be part of the United States. Would the U.S. have any right to say, hey, those Quebec separatists, we think of them as independent because they really want to be part of us. Oh, they need us to help keep them safe. We're going to send some tanks there. Give me a break, guys. It's absolutely absurd. Now, we have video from the EU foreign policy chief, Josep Borrell, who is still kind of hedging a little bit as to the terms that are being used. Let's take a listen.
Well, the Russian troops has entered in Donbass. We consider Donbass part of Ukraine. So certainly, the Russian troops entered into the Donbass, Ukrainian, I wouldn't say that a fully fledged invasion, but Russian troops are on the Ukrainian soil.
Yeah, they've invaded one part of Russia, is what one part of Ukraine. The idea may be just do this and then back off. We don't know. And again, I hope that people recognize that all along I've said we can make assessments based on the signals, but we don't really know what Putin plans to do. This could just be one tiny step a day. So there's never any one day where it's like, wow, look at what happened. And then they move towards Kyiv. It's not completely clear. We are also going to have to consider what Putin's greater ideology here is. And it's sort of like the idea of pointing back to the former USSR. Ukraine is really important in Putin's mind in kind of recreating that. And we'll talk about that on the bonus show today. But also in terms of tactics, this is really kind of back to like an old war concept, which is, can you just change your country's borders by force? Since World War II, and since the codification in international law that prohibits the threat or use of force against territorial integrity or political independence, we've seen few attempts to just change your country's border by force in this degree. Now, you could say, well, there's a bunch of areas of the border in India where there are constant disputes and small skirmishes and little bits of land taken and given back, and it is changing the border in a way by force. In major ways, there have really only been 4 attempts since World War II. North Korea in 1950 trying to conquer South Korea. North Vietnam successfully conquering South Vietnam in 1975. Indonesia annexing Timor-Leste in 1975. And that very short-lived Iraqi annexation of Kuwait in 1990 before it was liberated in what we call the first Gulf War. So this is not super common since World War II. It will be important not only to watch what happens in Russia, but also to watch China's behavior and ambitions on the basis of what happens with Russia, Ukraine, because if Russia gets away with this, China's interest in similar action with Taiwan may increase. So a lot at play here. And in the immediate, it's going to remain extraordinarily chaotic. One of our sponsors is Nebbia, who's introducing their newest shower head, the Nebbia by Mon Quattro. It was designed by former NASA engineers who spent years researching how to save water. Quattro is the world's best high-pressure water-saving shower head, starting at just $119. And Quattro uses 40 to 50% less water than traditional shower heads, helping the planet, helping your wallet, still giving you the high-pressure water stream you love with 4 different spray modes. Literally takes 1 to 2 minutes to install. Easy as screwing in a light bulb. I love it. I have the rain shower version. I've been using Nebbia shower heads for a while now. I love saving the water, and I love the high-pressure spray. It's really the best of both worlds. Nebbia, the maker of Quattro, also offers sustainable bathroom accessories. I have the soft gray bath mat and the Nebbia double shelf. The Quattro shower head is just $119, but Nebbia is giving you 10% off when you go to nebbia.com/Pacman and use the promo code Pacman. The link is underneath this video.